Today we're going to talk a little bit about biochemistry. Biochemistry is a field of chemistry that looks at the relationship between chemistry and biological systems. And a biological system could be anything within the realm of biology, which we usually think about as living things in some way, shape, or form. So we're talking about the chemistry of life when we're talking about biochemistry. And we have four major biomolecules that we discuss, and some of them will be pretty familiar to us. Today we're going to talk about carbohydrates. In another video we'll talk about lipids, which include fats and steroids. In another still we'll talk about proteins, which we probably recognize from our diet. And then still in another, nucleic acids, which are some of our genetic material. They literally put the NA in DNA, nucleic acids. So those are our four biomolecules. Now, from organic chemistry, which was the chemistry of carbon, we learned that carbon has a lot of flexibility, and we can make up these really long molecules that are made up of repeating individual units. And these long molecules that are made up of these individual repeating units are called polymers, and the individual repeating units part of those are called monomers. Okay, so the individual units are monomers, and they make up these long chain molecules that are called polymers. And this is going to be kind of an important idea when we're talking about relating molecules to biological systems, because a lot of the important biomolecules, which are molecules with biological significance, are polymers. So let's talk about biomolecules. Okay, so this gets us into kind of our four different biomolecules, which I mentioned before. And the one that I want to talk about and focus on today are called carbohydrates. Carbohydrates. The word itself actually tells you a lot about what's inside of them. Carbo, referring to the carbon. Hydrate, referring to hydrogen and oxygen. So carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that's it. So they're usually in these ring structures, and they're made up of individual repeating units called monosaccharides. Monosaccharides. So this is kind of the monomer, if you want to think about it that way, of our carbohydrates. And when we're thinking about carbohydrates in our diet, we think about things like bread and pasta, right? If you think about low carb diet, then think about all the things that you cut out. So the bread and the pasta, potatoes, all the starches, and also sugars. So carbohydrates are important for a number of different reasons in our body, but kind of the two main functions that carbohydrates serve for both humans as well as other organisms are energy in both a short and long-term capacity, and structure. And in both of these capacities, they're made up of larger molecules that are made up of these individual repeating units that are monosaccharides. That's the monomer for our carbohydrates. Now, the term saccharide comes from the word saccharin. Saccharin, which is an old adjective that used to mean like sickly sweet, and it refers to sugars. So like sugary sweet is something that is saccharin. Might have an E on the end. Saccharin. Yeah, that looks right. Alright, so monosaccharides then are single sugars. Mono referring to one, and then the saccharide referring to sugar molecules. So I want to tell you kind of what they look like, and I'm going to draw a couple examples of them, and we'll kind of go from there. So one of the most common, or the one that people tend to know, monosaccharides is glucose. Glucose is blood sugar, or the sugar that is carried around in our blood in order to get from one place to another as it's needed for a variety of functions. And we usually associate glucose in general with diabetes and glucose levels with diabetics who have to keep track of such things because they are often out of whack due to their disease. Now I'm going to draw these like a skeletal diagram. So at each of my corners here is a carbon, except for this corner. This corner is an oxygen. And at each of these other corners is a carbon. And off of each of those, I'm going to draw some stuff. And the stuff that comes off of them is important, but we're not going to get into a lot of detail about structure in this particular context. If you're interested, I have some other videos on that in a little more detail. But for right now, this is just an introduction to what they look like. And I want you to be able to recognize that if you see a molecule that looks like this, it is a monosaccharide. So the first thing you'll notice is the ring structure. And this is a 6-membered ring with an oxygen in it. And the chemical formula for this thing is C6H12O6. And as you're counting up the pieces and parts, so here's your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. And if we look at our oxygens, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 oxygens. And hydrogens, you might say, okay, well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where's my other hydrogen? I just didn't draw it off the bottom here. There should be another one off of there because carbon needs to make 4 bonds, and I just ran out of space in my ring. So that's C6H12O6, which is glucose, which is blood sugar, and that's the way that it looks. Now there's an isomer of this, which means that it's the same chemical formula but a different bonding pattern. This is a structural isomer, and it looks like this. It's a 5-membered ring with an oxygen in it. And again, at each of my corners here, 1, 2, 3, 4 are a carbon. And then I'm going to draw, again, some stuff hanging off of these things. More stuff hanging off of these things. More stuff, and more stuff. Alright, so if we look at this guy, it's got the same number of carbon, same number of oxygen, same number of hydrogen, but it's a 5-membered ring instead of a 6-membered ring, so it's not glucose anymore. This one is fructose. And that's fruit sugar. You probably recognize fructose because it's in high fructose corn syrup, which you hear a lot about as a sweetening agent. It's one of the ones that we perceive as being the sweetest of the sugars. So if you've ever had fructose compared to some other types of sugars, then you would notice it more sweet. We as humans perceive that sweetness. Okay, so this is an isomer. These are structural isomers, and in terms of functional groups, you'll notice that there's a number of alcohols, these hydroxyl groups that are sticking off the sides of these rings, and this is also kind of an ether functional group, carbon, oxygen, carbon sandwiches on each of these guys. So we have a couple different of those functional groups that we talked about in our organic chapter, and now we're kind of putting them together in these ring structures. Now honey is a mixture of both fructose and glucose. They're not bonded together, it's just a mixture of these monosaccharides, and that's what we get from bees, you know, and that's why it's nice and sweet. Now if we were to bond these two things together through what is called a dehydration reaction, then these two alcohol groups are going to react, and when these two react, then I get 2 H's and an O, so I'm getting rid of a water molecule, hence dehydration reaction. And when I put them together, then I'm going to get a structure that looks like this. So here's my ring from my glucose. Here's the oxygen that's left over that is now bonded to this other ring. This is my ring from my fructose. Okay. And then I still have all the component stuffs hanging off of it. I lost a water in the process, but that's not a big deal. It's a little bit of a molecule parade today. But just for clarity's sake. Okay, now I have these two that are bonded together, fructose and glucose, and now there's 2. It's not a monosaccharide anymore, this is a disaccharide. And this is the reaction that links together all of my sugars. I remove a water and I can hook them together. And then if I have those two alcohol groups, those two hydroxyl groups anywhere in proximity to each other, then I can make a whole long chain of those. I can make a polymer out of those individual repeating units. So for these guys, these are still simple sugars. This is still a disaccharide, and this linkage of glucose and fructose is called sucrose, which you've maybe also heard of before. It's table sugar. Sucrose. Now you'll note that all of the endings on these end in OSE, and a lot of these organic molecules and biomolecules will give you an indication about what functional groups are in them, or will give you an indication about what biomolecule they are, or what they do in our body based on just the name alone. So anytime you see something that ends in this OSE ending, you'll know it's a sugar in some way, shape, or form. Now these are all still simple sugars, but we can get more complex. So disaccharides and monosaccharides are simple sugars or simple carbohydrates. And our body has a pretty easy time breaking these down. But if we put a whole bunch of them together, if we make a polymer out of these, so longer chains give us complex sugars or complex carbohydrates. Or polysaccharides. And these have an entirely different function in our body. So we talked about how they're used for energy and for structure. And these polysaccharides, these complex carbohydrates, are used in the same type of way. Now, in fructose, if you think high fructose corn syrup, or if you think about some of the other simple sugars, those sugars are going to give us a quick source of energy. So you eat a candy bar, you get some energy out of that, and then you burn off the energy, and then you crash an hour later, right? But some of these molecules, as we build them up into these more complex carbohydrates, these polysaccharides, are for longer term energy. So we have this source of energy if we need it. It tends to be responsible for things like the fight or flight response, so we need a quick source of energy when that saber-toothed tiger comes after us, or if we need to go fight a dragon or whatever it is, then we have this this quick source of energy that we can pull from. And so as these bond together, so now we have these larger complex carbohydrates, we get molecules such as things like starch. Starch is a complex carbohydrate. And when you think about starch, you probably think of, I think potatoes always, anything that's kind of starchy. This comes from plants. And they use starch to, it's a bunch of glucose. So it's a way to store glucose. And you can break apart those bonds. So we have a bunch of glucoses stuck together. We can break apart those bonds, get some energy out of that, utilize the glucose, and get some more energy out of that. And so plants can use glucose, the stored glucose, in times when they aren't photosynthesizing. So they can store up all their excess photosynthesis product, which is glucose, and then they can use it when they aren't doing photosynthesis, like when it's dark outside, for instance. Now we do something similar in our bodies, although we don't do photosynthesis, obviously. And in our bodies it's called glycogen. So this is what animals use in our muscle tissue. It's also in our livers. Animals use this to store glucose. And it's stored in animal tissue and muscle tissue specifically. And also, like I said, the liver. So if you have too much of it, then it's stored in the liver. But in general, it's in your muscles. And this is part of how you can have a quick source of energy if you need a burst of energy for some reason. So if you're on the couch, for instance, and all of a sudden you have to go and catch something, or you have to go and run out of the house because it's on fire or something, then that glycogen would kick in. You could break off those glucoses and use them for energy storage, or that stored energy you can use as a source of quick energy. The third in this complex carbohydrate kind of list is cellulose. Cellulose, and of course I misspelled it. This is a U. Cellulose. And again, if you look at the ending, the OSE ending refers to the fact that it's a carbohydrate or a sugar in general. And cellulose is something that we've seen before when we talked about making paper. Paper is made out of cellulose fibers, and cellulose is a primary component in cellular walls in plant cells. So if you kind of know your biology a little bit, you know that animal cells have a cell membrane, and they're kind of a bag of fluid, right? And they have a nucleus in them, and then they have some mitochondria. Those are pretty good. And you have like ribosomes and maybe like a Golgi apparatus and all sorts of other parts, endoplasmic reticulum, etc. So here's your cell, and a cell membrane is what contains all the stuff on the inside. This is for animals. Eukaryotic cells. Now plant cells are different because they're more rigid in their structure. They still have a cell membrane, but that cell membrane is protected on the inside by this layer of cell wall. And within the cell wall is this cellulose. So this is what I mean when I said that carbohydrates are used for structure. The cellulose, these fibers, are used in these cell walls in order to give some rigidity to these cells and to protect what's on the inside, which is the same kind of stuff. You know, I have all the same stuff, except I also have chloroplasts, which can do the photosynthesis, etc. Right? So the cellulose is the primary component of the cell wall, and isn't used in the same way. We're not using it for energy. It's really used in structure, and it's something that we don't digest. So we as human beings don't digest it, and some animals don't as either. So cellulose is often used as dietary fiber. If you've ever taken fiber tablets or things like Metamucil or stirred in fiber to a smoothie or something, then what you were doing is mostly putting cellulose in there. And that's not something that we digest, but our body can kind of use it as something to clean things out and help with regularity, all that kind of stuff. And that doesn't have anything to do with energy and sugar in the same context that we usually think about sugar. We think about sugar as the energy, but the cellulose and the structure of these things can also serve a function and a purpose within biological systems. Okay, so that's it for carbohydrates, and I'll talk to you again soon about lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. And if you have any questions on this, don't hesitate to ask.